A Mediterranean Mystery by Fred E. Wynne. Chapter 8. We are caught in a camp scene. As I got used to the apparent insecurity of my position and the rocking motion which the camel's gait imposes on one, I began to find something soothing in the slow but dignified progression. The vast monotony of the desert had a hypnotic effect, and I was even anxious lest I might fall asleep and slip from my lofty perch. The heat was most oppressive, and I noticed a new quality in the slight wind. It was from the south, a quarter it had not blown from before, and it came in puffs like a breath from the open door of a furnace, a dry fierce heat that burned one's cheek and made the eyes smart. In the full glare of the afternoon sun the desert was disappointing in its monotony. I had read novels full of word painting and gush about the mystery and wonder of the desert. I had seen it in a moment of iridescent loveliness at dawn. But now there was neither mystery nor beauty. It was just sand, sand and loose stones, stretching everywhere in billows to the ring of the horizon. The ridges of sand hid nothing but other ridges, and hollows full of sand. I found I hated it. Away to the south, in the wind's eye, the horizon was darkened by a strange haze, yellowish brown rising slowly higher in the sky, a queer, unnatural, threatening cloud. There were three Arab boys who trudged along beside the baggage camels, occasionally addressing what sounded like insults to them. I thought they looked uneasily from time to time at the southern sky and tried to hurry the unwilling camels. The hot wind blew every moment stronger and more steadily, and now it blew up a cloud of dust and sand from the shuffling feet of the camels. Jacob rode on ahead with a mounted Arab, whom I took to be the owner or at least the hirer of the camels. We were travelling about east-southeast, our route making an acute angle with the coast. After about an hour's going, the desert rose to a stony ridge where there was an outcrop of some pale fossiliferous rock which lay in flat slabs like an artificial pavement. Turning to look back from the summit of this ridge, I found I could see the sea again. It was ruffled and grey. Darker cat's paws flew over it here and there, and already the waves were beginning to curl and show white gleams of foam. The Astote was visible near the skyline, standing out to sea with a free sheet. My heart yearned after her as I thought of the familiar cozy saloon and the friendly faces I had left. Jacob halted his camel and waited till I came up. He salaamed respectfully, perfect in his part of dragoman, and rode side by side with me. "It will be a bad night, Effendi," he said. "It is a camp scene." "Well, I suppose we must grin and bear it." I spoke boldly, though I quailed at the word camp scene. I had heard so much of this dreaded wind. "As long as the camels will travel," he said, "but the sky looks as if it will be a very bad sandstorm. How far is it to this place we are going to? If the camels go well, we might do it in 6 hours, in 5 hours from now, but it will be difficult to find the place in a sandstorm. What is this ruin? Another sheikh's tomb? No, no, this very great ruin. How do you call a mosque of the ancients? A temple? That is it. It is the temple of Osiris. Very grand ruin. There's plenty shelter there for all, camels and all. Is there any shelter nearer? We could go back where I fetched the camels from, about 2 hours now. How long will the storm last? It is a camp scene. It may last 3 days. Then we must go on and find the temple if we can. It is as your Excellency wishes. I had almost forgotten it was Jacob speaking through the mouth of this pleasant, respectful servant, but now he added with a touch of the familiarity I loathed. If anyone is looking for Jacob, he will not find him in a camp scene. I ignored this remark. And they will not find what the camels are loaded with, he said with his most insolent sneer. I could have chastised him with scorpions, but I maintained silence and only looked my disapproval. I knew silence was more dignified than any speech to such a man. Besides, I had no doubt at the time that he was trying to find out from me what the packing cases contained. But there was in his smile a suggestion that we shared some vile secret, a suggestion which gave me nausea of the soul. He trotted forward and rejoined his companion, and at once I heard an order shouted to the footboys, who began belabouring their camels, and the whole procession moved forward at a mended pace. I ventured to guide my camel a little to the right so as to bring it to windward of the baggage camels, and out of the dust their feet stirred up. I was gratified to find the animal obedient, even obsequious. Then the wind suddenly grew stronger. I cannot say it freshened, for it came as a hot blast that burned and threatened. The surface of the desert seemed to slide away from the camel's feet as the loose sand shifts away with the receding wave in shallow water. It made me giddy to look down at it. The air became dark, opaque, with the sand blown up from 1,000 miles of red-hot desert. The particles of sand drove and pricked my skin. Sand filled my eyes and nostrils and stuck to the streaming surface of my sweating face and hands. I had to keep close to the baggage animals. I had a horror of losing touch with them in this new strange opacity. I knew that if I found myself alone I should go mad with horror. I felt the beast under me tremble with some similar terror, and for the first time there was sympathy between us. The scorching wind hummed in my ears with a strange thin sound, mingled with the hiss of the moving sand. It made my helmet a maddening encumbrance, and set loose parts of my clothes and the corners of the rugs I sat on flapping. The flying sand was all around us now, and sky and sun were blotted out. I knew that the sun was near its setting, and dreaded to think of the darkness of night added to this new terrifying darkness. A blank misery of fear settled down upon me, and I cursed the wretchedness of my discomfort. It seemed impossible that I should be here, perched unfamiliarly on the back of a camel, unprotected and wretched amid the unknown dangers of this horror of the sand. The thought of my home came to me, of Bates and Mrs. Rattray. What had brought me here? The darkness became denser and denser, and I felt that the sun had set. But its going brought no coolness. The burning wind seemed now to parch my lungs. My camel was pressed up to the baggage animals, its nose almost touching the tail of the beast before it. It evidently shared my dread of finding itself alone. Much as I hated Jacob, it was a relief when he again joined me. "You all right, Effendi?" he asked. "All right," I said. I would not expose my craven fear to him. I could have found it in my heart to bless him when he handed me a bottle of tepid water. As a rule, I hate drinking out of a bottle. I have seldom done it, I have not got that knack. The motion of the camel did not make it easier, and some of the precious water ran over my chin and down my neck. Nevertheless, that was the most precious drink of all my lifetime. "Shall we be able to find the way?" I asked. "Oh, yes, we will find it. The camels know," said Jacob, "but we must not halt. It might be impossible to make them start again." "I don't want to halt." "Good. The Effendi is very strong. What you call very hard, is it not? There will be times when we will be able to see a little with the moon, when the sand will not be so thick in the air to blind us. So we will find the temple and rest." The man's confidence encouraged me, and I could not but admire it in face of the wrath of nature. Every joint of me ached with the ungainly motion of my mount, and my skin was become as sodden paper. A stream of tears cut channels in the dust that plastered my face. Sometimes the darkness lightened a little, and a greenish light filtered through the sand from the invisible moon, reminding me of the faint light that comes down through the water in glazed tanks of a darkened aquarium. I could now just see the pale hindquarters of the beast in front of me, and the long neck and head of my own solemnly bowing as it went. I do not know how long this torment lasted, for I lost all count of time. My only fear was lest the camels should stop in their march, and I counted every painful step again. I had reached the stage of half conscious misery when suddenly the wind seemed to cease blowing. There were harsh guttural shouts from the Arab boys, and the camels stopped. Then I felt rather than saw the loom of a vast building beside me on my right. An Arab boy came and took the head rope from my hand, and dragging at it he made a noise as though he was clearing his throat of all the colds that ever afflicted humanity. Again I was flung backwards and forwards as my camel folded itself up and came to rest on the ground. I slid off too weak in the knees even to get out of the range of its teeth. But the poor beast made no assault on me, and I felt that it had carried me faithfully and well and was grateful. I saw a match struck, and Jacob came up with a lantern. My heart faintly warmed to him. "All right, Effendi?" he asked again. "All right," I said. "You have done well to find this place on such a night, Jacob." "The camels have the wisdom that Allah has bestowed," he answered quite simply and humbly. I came nearer liking him then than at any moment of our short intercourse, but I distrusted him profoundly all the same, and the pressure of Edmund's revolver against my hip was a kind of comfort to me. "This way, Effendi," he said, making a kind of servile sweep with his lantern. I followed him into what I took at first to be a cave, but there was a hot draught and sand blowing through it, and the swinging light of Jacob's lantern lit up great blocks of stone that must have been placed there by human agency. I don't know why, but I followed him more willingly when I realized that I was among the work of human hands. However many thousand years they had been dead, then I would have followed into some crevice that represented a mere process of nature. My feeling about Jacob demanded human allies, however remote in time. I realized that this was some gateway or entrance in the vast building that had saved us from the sandstorm. Jacob turned sharply to the left, and I followed him through a narrow entrance where I had to stoop among enormous blocks of stone. I found myself in a moderate-sized chamber. As far as I could see by the feeble light, it was built entirely of stone. Some of the stone was blackened as though by fire. There was another opening in the great stonework that looked like the beginning of a narrow staircase, but I was too tired for exploration. The floor was soft sand, and there was no wind blowing here. I sat down thankfully and began scooping dust out of my eyes. Two of the Arab boys who had walked by the baggage camels came in with rugs and mats, and the hamper packed by Hassan. Jacob gave them directions in their own language, and all these people busied themselves about providing for my comfort. I asked myself why I hated Jacob and how I knew that he despised me. I did not know these Arab boys at all. If among them they had decided to put me to death, they would have an easy task. They might have done it before I could even have pointed my revolver at them. Jacob skilfully made a kind of couch for me with the rugs, and opened the hamper. Hassan had packed enough to keep me for a week, so there was no need to economize. I did not know what provisions Jacob or the Arabs might have. After all, he had so far served me well. I offered him some meat and bread, which he gratefully accepted. I suppose, I said, you do not drink wine, Jacob. I keep the fast of Ramadan, Excellency, he said, but for the rest of the year, he ended with a shrug and a smile which seemed to suggest his belief in the tenderness of Allah towards human nature, which could not always live up to the exacting standard of the Prophet. The wind has burned the roots of my tongue on the sand grates in the gateway of my lungs, he added apologetically, as he drank off the tumbler of Burgundy I handed him. The wine revived him, and I realized that he too had been suffering from the exhaustion of our terrible ride, but had waited on me before refreshing himself. I finished my strange picnic alone in this dim vault of some old forgotten worship, then lying down on the outspread rug, I slept profoundly in the sand. When I awoke, a faint daylight was trickling in through a kind of irregular hole or tunnel in the titanic masonry that surrounded me. A distant humming of the wind recalled to my mind the horrors of the storm outside, and I knew it had not abated. During the night, sand had drifted even into this chamber of mine. I was covered with it as I lay, and I noticed it piled up like snow against the further wall. But someone, Jacob I knew it must be, had left a canvas bucket of water beside me, and I was able to have the wash my soul was craving for. The faint light made me think that it was dawn, although the heat even here was oppressive, but looking at my watch I found it was 12 o'clock. I had slept for 10 hours. At first I could hardly move my aching limbs, but the healing touch of the water restored me. My parched skin seemed to absorb it, and my courage, such as it was, became restored. I began to take a kind of pleasure in the sense of adventure, and thought with pride of the story I should have for the other old fogies at the Athenaeum. If I had had a companion I should have been happy, but it was lonely work as it was. I made a table of my hamper and breakfasted heartily on lukewarm ham and the remains of the bottle of wine I had broached overnight. Then I began to explore my surroundings. I went down the short, narrow passage leading from the chamber, and found that it opened into what looked at first like a tunnel through which the wind on the sand still raved. This tunnel, I found, was really a gateway piercing a vast wall, in the thickness of which my chamber was built. I turned to the right, retracing our steps of the night before, and came out into the day, which I found was darkened by the sandstorm. I huddled under the lee of the great wall, and I could see the camels were still lying there in a row, placidly chewing the cud with the queer sideways movement of their jaws. The nearest turned its head and looked at me with a sneer of ineffable contempt. I went back and found that opposite to the passage which led to my chamber was another similar opening. Listening, I heard the deep, fierce tones of Arabic talk and a man laughing. I guessed there must be another chamber there where Yaqub and the Arabs had taken refuge. I felt I would be glad of even Jacob's society, but shyness prevented my seeking him, shyness and nothing else. I returned to my chamber, intent on exploring the staircase or passage I had seen leading from it. The opening led, as I thought, to remains of a broken staircase, roughly spiral in the thickness of the great wall. Many of the steps were broken away, and I was soon in darkness. I came back, shuddering for Jacob's lantern which he had left with me, and stiff and sore and frightened as I was, I clambered up and came at last out into the rushing, blinding storm again, on the top of the vast wall of the temple. It was broken into irregular masses of enormous masonry, and must originally have been some 20 feet in width. The tunnel piercing the bottom of the wall was 40 feet in length, and I guessed I must be about 60 feet above the ground. But the storm drove me down before I could form any estimate of its length or discover how much of the building existed. I could see nothing through the driving sand. I came back to my chamber, which had already begun to seem homelike to me, and Jacob was there waiting for me. I was glad to see him. I think I would have been glad of the company of an orangutan, if adequately chained, for I was finding out what a horrible thing solitude can be, although it was not 24 hours since I had parted with Edmund and welfare. Jacob greeted me with his invariable all right, and I grunted at him for reply. I felt I had a reputation as an English gentleman to maintain. "We cannot start the camels today, Effendi," he went on. "The sand is still very bad." "We didn't reckon to travel today," I reminded him. "What about tonight?" He shrugged his shoulders in his disgustingly expressive way. "No good, Effendi. The camels would not put their heads, I mean what you call, face it. It may blow all tomorrow again, or it might stop tonight." "Well, we've got to wait for it then, and not worry," I answered irritably. "How are you and the other fellows off for food?" "We have enough to eat. The others like the Excellency's white bread if there is any to spare. The wine made paradise of my stomach." I gave him a loaf of bread and a bottle of wine. "What about water?" I asked. "There is here a very good well. All the water bottles I have filled. The camels have drunk when they did not expect. They give thanks. But the sand drives even here, and there is today and tonight. If the Effendi likes and will come 5 minutes through the storm, I can show him better shelter. Very good place, no wind, no sand, very cool place." I was used now to the place I was in, and averse from changing it until I started back to civilization. I was profoundly distrustful of Yakub, and I did not like the idea of going out again into that stinging storm. But the man offered me better quarters. I had no good reason for refusing to try them. I was determined not to seem to fear him, and my wretched shyness prevented me from discussing the matter and questioning him as any sensible man would have done. "Very well," I said, "go on." He led me out again, and we trod the ankle-deep sand past where the camels lay. They were, of course, unloaded and looked very contented and supercilious. We reached the limits of the great wall, and I could just see that it was only one part of a vast building. We were at an angle where another wall met it, but the driving sand hid all the mysteries of the structure. Jacob led me away from the temple and down the slope of a ridge on which it seemed to be built. I had to keep my head down for protection from the moving sand, but even so I could see that I was stumbling over masses of broken, worthless pottery. I passed fragments of marble pillars and fractured capitals lying in the sand. My feet slid on the loose sand covering a portion of tessellated pavement. There had been Greek arches here, and I knew that, as I suspected, I was among the ruins of some old Ptolemaic pleasance and place of worship. Jacob stopped. "Down here, Effendi," he called through the wind, pointing to a hole that the moving sand had silted up but could not fill. I hesitated. It was like being invited to go down a rabbit burrow. Jacob disappeared down the hole, and his lean, brown, beautiful hand alone was left inviting me to follow. I took his hand and went down after him. It was impossible to hesitate, alone there in that blinding hurricane. I slid down through sand, and sand followed my clumsy descent like an avalanche. Then I found my feet on rock. I felt my way down a rough descent with Jacob's lost assistance, and I found myself on level, solid ground in total darkness. Jacob had brought his lantern and lit it at once. At first I could see nothing but his hated face smiling into mine. "All right here, Effendi," he said, and behind him I saw all the packing cases the camels had carried. Although I had seen the camels were relieved of their loads, I had never thought of how the things might be bestowed. I had thought of nothing but my own discomfort and had accepted all Jacob's efforts to lessen it. He and his Arabs must have worked hard to get all this merchandise down here while I slept. I recognized that he did not despise me without some reason. Of course, Edmund or welfare would have seen the stuff bestowed before anything else. I had shown myself a mere passenger. Jacob saw me looking at the packing cases. They would be hard to find here, like Jacob, he said. I took the lantern from him and began to examine the cave, for such I took it to be. I found myself in a large rectangular chamber hewn out of the solid rock that here closely underlay the desert sand. At one end of it I found a grave-like excavation about 3 feet deep and 6 feet long. I saw the remains of an earthenware pipe leading into it and turned away with an involuntary shudder. In the opposite wall there was a narrow pointed opening. I had to stoop to go through it and found myself in a circular chamber. There were low seats or sedilia carved in the rock all around, and over each seat a square niche cut in the rock. In the center were the broken remains of a slab of rock which could only have been an altar. I did not know what hateful rites had been celebrated on it, but everything told me I was in a place of ancient secret worship. I recalled a smattering recollection of a Mithraic superstition with its bloodbath. That was probably the meaning of the grave-like place with its conduit. Here men had hidden themselves from the light of day 2,000 years ago, and here a man lost now would never be recovered. Jacob smiled in my face. I put my hand on the revolver. If this were a trap he had led me into, I swore to myself that he should die in it too. No sand comes here, he said. The Effendi will be cool while we wait. It was evident that the man was still considering only my comfort. My fears of him were nothing but the cowardice of jangled nerves. The 2 Arab boys joined us bearing my rugs and hamper, some extra candles and a copy of the Contemporary Review with an article of my own in it, the sort of encumbrance that clings so long to civilized man. And under Jacob's directions they proceeded to make a kind of couch for me, where I should be able to spend the hours before us in comparative comfort. Then they left me. I began to read my own article in the Review, but I found that matters that had once seemed intensely interesting and important had become profoundly boring, and I slept. I suppose it was exhaustion, but I slept most of that afternoon. I fed again and went to sleep again. So I spent those hours amid circumstances that from a distance would have seemed the most enthralling. But I had examined this weird subterranean chamber. Its bare rock faces had nothing more to tell my ignorance. I had not the knowledge or experience to interpret the history that might be graven on them. I slept again lightly and not for very long. Consciousness returned in the form of uneasiness. I was in utter darkness, but awake and alert. I was in no uncertainty as to my whereabouts or the recent events that had brought me there. I was not even quite sure that I had slept. I knew I had but to stretch out my hand to find a box of matches and light my candle, but I found I could not make the effort. Fear kept my hand immobilized. I can say honestly that it was no mere superstitious dread of my surroundings. I was perfectly conscious of my unseen environment of hewn rock beneath the remote desert. I was untroubled by any thought of possible horrors enacted there in the distant past. Yet I was afraid, afraid of some human presence that I knew was there, invisible and unfelt, unheard, yet palpable in the darkness and silence which surrounded me. I lay there conscious that my face was distorted by fear, waiting, longing for something, anything that would stimulate any normal human sense. I think I could have welcomed the thrust of a dagger if it had ended that horrible suspense in the darkness of the old subterranean church of a forgotten religion. Something moved near me and the spell was broken. I was aware of myself sitting up, my blanket thrown aside, my left arm doubled across my face by some defensive instinct. "Who's that?" said a voice that must have been mine. Without knowing what I did, my right hand went out and found the matches beside me. The box rattled faintly as I grasped it, and before it rattled again, before I could move it towards my left hand, my hand was seized and held in a soft, firm grip. I fell backwards again, incapable of effort. "No light, Effendi. Make no sound. There is danger." It was Jacob's voice whispering. I dreaded and feared the man, yet I knew his whisper was not that of my murderer. I felt that, for the time at all events, we were allies against some unknown danger threatening us both. "What is it?" I asked, whispering like him. "Let go my hand." "You will make no light if my hand leaves your hand?" "No, not till you tell me. Why are you here?" The delicate, firm pressure of his hand was removed, and I was again out of touch with the universe. But I was relieved. All those visceral disturbances which attend pure fright began to adjust themselves. The pumping of my heart ceased to be palpable, the rhythm of my breathing was restored, and I was conscious that I was no longer making queer faces in the dark. These are but normal reactions to stimuli labeled cowardice by the insensitive. I'm as little inclined to apologize for them as for hunger or seasickness. They passed, and reflection returned to aid my will. "Why have you come, Jacob?" I asked of the darkness. It was strange to speak, not knowing in which direction to send my voice, nor whether my hearer was close to me or far away. "I must remain here with you, Effendi. Those who seek me have come. They too shelter from the storm. They seek also this that we have brought with us. But Allah is merciful, and I remember to put it here where they will not find it." From the sound of Jacob's whisper I could tell that his usual imperturbability had gone. There was fear in every syllable he uttered. Fear is said to be contagious, yet I took heart. Those who sought him must be the police. I knew, of course, that he was a hunted man. But I had nothing to fear from the police, and as yet I had no reason to suppose that they were concerned with our merchandise. They would, of course, examine it if they found it, and that, as welfare had so carefully explained, would spoil the market for our rare earths for incandescent mantles. I felt that I had nothing to lose by their discovering Jacob. I shrank from the thought of sharing with him a long vigil in this subterranean darkness, and his arrest would rescue me from this. Even if I wanted to, however, I could make no move to compass his arrest. At present he was in a sense my protector, at least my ally. The least suspicious move on my part would convert him into a deadly and ruthless foe, and I remembered how he had instantly found my hand, as though he saw in the darkness while I was blind and helpless. Looking back now, I think all these prudential calculations passed through my mind really in an attempt to justify a feeling of loyalty to what was, after all, my side. However I might hate and distrust Jacob, I was yet pledged in a sense to abide by him. So I resigned myself to the long wait, crouching there in the darkness of our stone vault. "How long will these men stay?" I asked at length. "When the campaign ends they will go, unless the camel men betray us." "And can you trust them?" "I trust no Arab, but they know it is death to betray me. But one can come in here at a time. Allah is very merciful and my knife is sharp. Many would die before Jacob is taken. If the Excellency will agree now to make no light or sound, I go to wait by the entry." It will soon be day, and a little light will come then, but to one from outside it will be dark in here. He would feel the knife of Jacob before he saw it, and then he would see no more. Go, Jacob, I said. I will not move. There was no sound, but I somehow felt that Jacob was withdrawn from close beside me. For a long time, as it seemed to me, I crouched there, my hands clasped round my knees, wondering if I were destined to be the helpless witness of a murder or series of murders. But gradually the strain on my mind, the heat, and the close, unchanged air numbed my spirits. I sank back thankfully on my rug and slept as soundly as though I were back in my own vicarage. I awoke unwillingly and unrested. There was a dim light by which I could just discern the graven rock that formed the walls and roof of our refuge, or our prison. It was Jacob's voice calling softly that had awakened me. I could see the outline of his figure squatting like a graven image by the entry, and a faint gleam from the blade of his knife. Untiring, he had watched there motionless while I had slept. "Well, Jacob?" I questioned. "It is day, Effendi, and the storm has gone. The Khamsin has spared us one day. The leader of the camels has come and says my enemies have gone, but that may be a trap." I rose wearily and went over to Jacob. By the entry there was a freshness in the air that revived me, and I noticed there was no longer any humming of the wind. "How shall we know if it is a trap, Jacob?" He fondled the knife in his hand and then looked up at me with pleading in his eyes. It was the first time he had humbled himself to me, and I saw that a vision of the jail at Tora was very clear to him. "I like not to ask it," he said at last, "but if the Effendi had courage to go first they would not harm him, and Yakub would at least be warned. If Yakub must die he will take some with him to bear false witness against him before the Prophet. But the Prophet is not deceived. He will intercede with Allah, and Allah is merciful to the true believer." Nothing could better have restored my self-esteem than this appeal. I had hitherto been entirely dependent on this abhorred protector, but now he needed my aid and appealed to my courage. I said no more, but walked past him and climbed up the steep and narrow entry to the desert surface above, dazzled indeed by the glare of light, but thankful to breathe again the fresh pure air of morning that was wafted across by a faint sea breeze. The terrible oppression of the hot wind had gone, the sand was at rest. My spirits rose as looking around I saw no trace of the enemy. The sun was just rising and the desert lay once more sparkling and burnished beneath its level rays. I saw before me the stately mass of the great temple of Osiris. The mighty wall wherein I had spent the first night and morning was revealed as part of a great quadrangle enclosing an enceinte of about 100 yards square. The wall and the gateway, which I seemed to know as a blind man knows things by his sense of touch, were the only parts of the building which retained any semblance of its original design. The rest was a vast tumbled ruin, wrecked by man and his unruliness, by nature and by time. I climbed again to the summit of the great wall where I had been the day before. There was a cool refreshing breeze, and I could see around me the great ruin, and on the slope below it what I took to be the outlines of a Ptolemaic pleasure city that had once been busy and important under the shadow of the temple's walls. Now the desert lay utterly barren all round, and far in the distance I could just see the sea with that bewildering blue of the butterfly's wing. Looking inland, I could still make out on the horizon a dozen horsemen, and through my field glasses could see the white uniforms, the red tarbooshes, and slung carbines which I presumed were worn by mounted police or troopers of the Egyptian army. Jacob's enemies had certainly gone. His cunning and foresight and the labors of those old worshippers of Mithras had saved him for the time being. Below me, the Arabs were busy reloading the camels, and I was eager to be on the road again, willing enough to leave behind me all these relics of ancient mystery and magnificence which for me were associated with that night of vigil and horror. A few hours later the temple had faded like a dream into the sand that surrounded us as our party toiled across the last few miles to the railway. We came to it at last, a wavy track following the contours of the desert, an iron link with civilization. There was a plain stone building for a station, and Jacob was almost immediately in the midst of a wordy fracas with the station master. This functionary came out and inspected our camels and their loads. He immediately fell into a state of almost maniacal excitement. My smattering of Arabic was not sufficient to enable me to gather more than the merest fragments of his complaint, but he seemed to be calling Allah and the Prophet to witness that no freight train ever could or would take such a load as ours was. Jacob let him rave, but the camel boys joined in, whether on the station master's side or against him, I could not tell. Even the camels put in their word. When they were all out of breath, Jacob said a few sharp authoritative words, which started the whole tornado of sound again. This happened several times, and then Jacob came up to me. "He requires 150 piastres baksheesh, Effendi. There is a train coming in half an hour. Had I more time I would make him to take less." I was so relieved to know that the train was nearly due that I did not grudge the money. The camels were unloaded and their owners led them away in dignified gratitude for liberal bakshish. The train came up like a miracle out of the desert. There was another scene with the cart, but now Jacob had a firm supporter in the station master, and for the consideration of 100 piastre note, the whole of our cargo was safely stowed on board. A feeling of intense relief from responsibility came over me as I found myself back in the impossibly familiar surroundings of a first class compartment, and 4 hours of heat and dust were the end of my physical discomfort. Remembering Edmund's injunction, I wiped my heated face and neck and donned my clerical collar as the train ran into the Gare de Caire at Alexandria. End of chapter 8.